Welcome to the Deep 404. American President Joe Biden is asking Congress for funding, $106 billion of funding. This is a collective package which covers funding for Ukraine, which is around $61 billion of the 106 is earmarked for Ukraine. It is also looking at providing some funding to Israel in its conflict with Hamas. About $14.5 billion set aside for Israel. The spending package, it also covers things such as some humanitarian aid, which will be spread across Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine. Also, another $7.5 billion reportedly for countering China. It sounds like it's a bit of a slush fund at this stage. There's no clear breakdown given on what that $7.5 billion will be spent on, but some of it is reportedly being given to the World Bank to allow the World Bank to provide alternative funding means to other nations to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Also, some of that countering China funding seems to be headed to some US submarine manufacturers. I think submarines are considered to be quite vital if a conflict does break out with China. Border security also gets $13.5 billion. Again, not completely clear on what this will cover. Things like detention facilities and funding to state and local governments who are dealing with monitoring, policing, transporting, housing people travelling up through Mexico into the southern states of the United States. So the strategy behind this funding bill, which is a common thing done in the American Congress, is that the funding for a number of items are bundled together. This makes it possible for someone like Joe Biden's administration to get funding for Ukraine, which many Republicans are questioning and are looking to reduce the level of spending in Ukraine, by tying it together with a package that includes funding for Israel, for example, or funding for the strengthening border security, things that the Republicans will vote for. And so collectively, they end up voting. The Republicans get some of the funding that they're after, and Biden gets his additional funding for Ukraine. Because I've been following this conflict for a year and a half and really focusing on it for a year, and then for the last 4 or so months, even reading and becoming more aware of what's going on, it boggles my mind that the Americans are sending another, or planning, or attempting to send another $60 billion into Ukraine. In 2022, the US Congress signed off on about $122 billion, and that's nearly all gone. So that's somewhere, I guess that's getting somewhere close to maybe $2 billion a week, a bit less than $2 billion a week is being spent in Ukraine. Of the American funding. Now, there's been other funding from the UN and other nations. So, I think all in all, the Ukrainians in this conflict must be spending upwards of $2.5–3 billion a week. So you can see why it's so vitally important that they maintain the funding, why that is becoming challenging now, as we're seeing now 14 million being taken out of a pot which possibly could have gone to Ukraine and now being sent to Israel. We've also got reports of the Israeli support package, including 155 millimeter shells. Those shells are desperately wanted by the Ukrainians. The current Congress, the House, which is Republican controlled at the moment, is speakerless. There are still votes going on to see who may be voted. Jim Jordan, who seemed to be the preferred choice for a number of Republicans, has not thus far been able to be successful, and so there are others now which may end up taking that role. This, though, not having a speaker there is likely to delay Congress on providing its approval on any funding. So President Zelensky in Ukraine will be starting to become very worried as these things draw out, as the conflict in Israel with Hamas escalates and grows. He can feel that attention moving away from him and moving to Israel. I might just jump into a little bit of what is happening in Israel at the moment, and then get down to some thoughts on if Iran will become involved in this, and then I'll jump back to a bit of an update on the previous 24 hours, the conflict in Ukraine. So it seems that the conflict in Israel isn't abating at this stage. There are continued Hamas attacks, rocket and missile attacks being launched into areas of Israel. There is ongoing fighting with elements of Hezbollah on the Lebanese southern border. There are hostage releases occurring. Not sure of, there was 2 American women have been released. Not certain of what the quid pro quo was for that, in what Hamas received. There has been some limited humanitarian aid allowed through the Rafah crossing, which is the crossing between Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, and the Gaza Strip. However, the reporting I've seen of that was that 20 or so aid vehicles were allowed through the crossing, and a large number which were there waiting were not allowed through. So while there is some aid getting through, the aid that is making its way into the Gaza Strip is nowhere near what is required to deal with the disastrous humanitarian crisis which is occurring there at the moment. The numbers of people there who have been killed, who are wounded, who are in need of medical attention, or just in need of basic facilities, water, medical supplies, warmth, clean drinking water, that sort of thing, even ready access to food, just some even some mental solace, those sort of things, those people just really aren't receiving. The Palestinian people in the area aren't receiving at this stage. Hamas seems to be moving away perhaps from the tactics of firing deep into Israel, and instead is favouring now more sabotage attacks near the Gaza Strip. There have been a number of the Israeli Merkava Mark IV tanks and armoured personnel carriers which have been near the Gaza Strip, have been targeted by Hamas. There are reports that there may be sort of up to 10 or more of those that have been destroyed by the Hamas fighters around the Gaza Strip, those Merkava tanks. Similar numbers may already have been destroyed on the southern Lebanon border in the Hezbollah fighting. But yeah, Hamas now seeming to work in closer areas, closer to the Gaza Strip, and using, as we see in the Ukrainian conflict, an increased use of FPV drones for dropping barrage munitions and dropping things from quadcopters and drones onto the Israeli tanks and armoured vehicles. Again, this is a tough thing and a sign of the times, but you see even the Israeli tanks now are incorporating the cope cages on top of the tanks, the wire mesh netting cages to stop the unmanned drones from striking the weak point of the tanks, instead hitting the netting, hopefully destroying themselves on the netting, and then the explosive force of whatever was attached to the drone or the grenade that was dropped explodes in the air rather than against the tank and damaging the tank. The use of electronic warfare capability hasn't really been reported yet in Israel, but no doubt the Israeli forces will be looking to deploy that soon, I would imagine, to try to take away the ability for the Hamas fighters to use FPV drones against them, that sort of thing. The Israeli Defense Force, or as the Palestinians refer to them, the Israeli Occupation Force, there was a brief pause after the bombing at the Al-Hali hospital, but the airstrikes have resumed. And so the Israelis now for sort of 2 weeks really have been bombing Hamas. There are some reports that there have been up to 1,000 bombs in a day dropped in the Gaza Strip. I can't corroborate if that is true, but there is ample video showing large-scale, massive bombing runs by the Israelis on the Gaza Strip. So those numbers may well be right. Israel has concentrated forces around the Gaza Strip on the northern and eastern borders. They are preparing for a ground offensive. That is what they have been saying. That's what the rhetoric is, and that is what appears to be happening with the large number of reservists being recalled to Israel and being put onto active duty. Still, we haven't seen that occur yet. Now, there can be many reasons for that. The Israelis may be looking to understand more about the Gaza Strip, where they will be fighting, looking to diminish perhaps locations of known underground bunkers for Hamas. So taking time to do that first, to try to really soften up the Hamas fighters before they send ground troops in. Israelis will be hesitant to lose large numbers of their troops in this fight. If they do, that's going to start to cause problems for them politically, but that is what everyone is expecting will happen if they go in there. So there is hesitancy, it seems, from Israel to embark upon a large ground force. Again, this is because tanks becomes difficult to use tanks in these urban areas where there are demolished buildings blocking the roadways, and where there are Hamas fighters native to the area who are familiar with it and who have prepared and are able to use weapons they do have, like anti-tank guided missiles, against your tanks in those situations. It seems as though, Israel will continue to use missile and bomb strikes on Gaza, on targeted areas, and in general. There certainly seems to be a lot of bombing which is taking out entire apartment blocks. Now, whether or not Israel believes those apartment blocks are housing Hamas fighters, those attacks are taking out and killing more than just the Hamas fighters in that area. There have been reports that there have been attacks by Hamas aimed at Israeli helicopters, and that their Apache helicopters, the prevalence of them engaging in the conflict over the last few days has slowed or stopped for a number of them. And instead the Israelis are looking at using drones in their attacks rather than having their pilots in helicopters coming under attack. There are, this is where my notes were for this point. Reports are actually it's 15 to 20 Merkava Mark IV tanks have been destroyed by Hamas units, and similar numbers reportedly destroyed by the Lebanese Hezbollah forces on the border over the last 7 to 10 days. Israel has large numbers of these tanks. I mean, Israel has probably upwards of 1,000 to 1,200 tanks in total, going from the Mark 1 Merkava right up to the Mark 4s, where they've got about 400 of those. So, of the parties involved in this, Hezbollah is the one which is probably the one to watch the most at the moment. They are at a low level already engaged. However, they are not actively and fully engaged. They are not. They're not launching all of the missiles that they have. They are not targeting deep into Israel. Hezbollah seems to be confining themselves to the Israeli locations around the southern border with Lebanon. Israel, however, has been launching air and artillery strikes into Lebanon, looking to destroy Hezbollah's facilities. So this activity, there's a slow burn escalation here. If something in particular happens here and Hezbollah commit, then the whole scenario changes here now, as Israel would then not have to deal just with the Hamas fighters in the Gaza Strip, but they would then have to redirect a number of their forces to the north to deal with Hezbollah, and that then raises the opportunity for the West Bank and for Syrian forces to even get involved. Now, there's reports that again today, this is the second or third time in the last 2 weeks, Israel has bombed or struck the Aleppo and Damascus airports in Syria and has rendered them inoperable and out of action. Israel's reasoning for why they're attacking these Syrian airports is to stop the Iranian supply of weapons into Syria. Now, I can't comment on if that is what is happening, but there is strong Iranian support for Syria, and so that supply of weapons through those airports may well be happening, and Israel is then looking to stop any weapons going into Syria that may be then directed towards Israel's border with Syria. Now, Yemen is also getting involved. The Houthi rebels have fired long-range missiles, several Quds 3 cruise missiles launched reportedly towards Israel. If we just go to the map here for a moment. Come on, map. There we go. So Yemen is down here, down on this lower area of the Arabian Peninsula. This is Saudi Arabia. This is a Sinai area of Egypt, and Israel up the top. Now, the USS Carney, a US destroyer, is in this area here, somewhere off the coast of Jeddah, somewhere in the Red Sea, and they have reportedly shot down a number of drones and missiles sent from Yemen. I don't know how they were able to determine that the missiles were headed for Israel, and they may have perhaps been given some warning to this. I don't know. And the reason I say this is because the Houthis are they've assumed control of northern parts of Yemen, and they are engaged in an ongoing conflict with the Yemeni government, and that the Yemeni government is backed very strongly by Saudi Arabia. So for the Houthis to be firing missiles and drones up over Saudi Arabia towards Israel, yeah, I don't know how they've been confirmed as being headed to Israel. But anyhow, this is the first time in sort of recent memory that a US Navy ship in the Middle East has engaged missiles and drones, at least not ones that were aimed at the ship. So this seems to be the US's first step into this conflict in a role of defending Israel from Yemeni missiles. Yeah, it's an interesting one to watch. If we've also got groups like Yemen now getting involved, Qatar, is someone to watch too. Now, Qatar are a very small nation over here on the Persian Gulf, right next to Bahrain here. They have a border with Saudi Arabia. Qatar, very rich, sitting on one of the Earth's largest supplies of gas. They are strong supporters of Hamas. Hamas's headquarters are in Qatar. Qatar also, though, by being a rich nation, by being very relatively friendly with the West, friendly with the US, they are a non-member ally of NATO. So they're also in a position where they are able to sort of broker deals, having relationships with Hamas and other nations in the area. But it'll be interesting just to watch what sort of support Qatar may provide to Hamas as this conflict continues. In terms of US support in this area, well, obviously they've got destroyers in the area, but there are now into the Mediterranean up here. There are 2 US carriers there. There is the Gerald Ford, and there is now the Eisenhower carrier groups are in the area. Also, the Americans have announced that they will deploy a battery of THAAD missile defense system to Ukraine, along with some additional Patriot systems. The THAAD is a terminal high altitude area defense anti-ballistic missile defense system, and it's aimed to shoot down short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles in their terminal phase, so as in their approach phase. And unlike the Patriot missile and a lot of other air defense missiles, these have a hit-to-kill approach. So they actually aim to, with a warhead with the kinetic energy of a physical warhead, strike the incoming ballistic missile, as opposed to Patriots and many others which use a fragmentation approach. So instead of actually attempting to strike the targeted missile, they just get close to it and explode a fragmentation cloud of debris which strikes the target, destroying it. But the THAADs are a different approach. Because of the way that they do this, they have this hit to kill. They actually physically target the missile they're trying to stop. They are, it's reported, susceptible to electronic warfare, interference, and jamming. So, yep, the US support, they're providing those. The Iranian Quds Force, their Brigadier General Ismail Khani, has reportedly arrived in Syria, and it is believed that he is going there to speak to and perhaps lead or coordinate pro-Iranian forces that have been amassing near the Syrian border with Israel. Now, the Quds Force, which the literal interpretation is the Jerusalem Force, is one of 5 branches of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They specialize in unconventional warfare and military intelligence. The US Army's Iraq War General Stanley McChrystal describes the Quds Force as an organization analogous to a combination of the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command in the United States. So they're responsible for extraterritorial operations, and they support, the Quds forces reportedly support non-state actors in many countries, including Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Houthis from Yemen. So, Iranian Brigadier General moving to Syria to coordinate perhaps those forces. So if this report is true, yeah, an interesting escalation. Iran themselves, it seems, are more inclined to support Hamas in this current conflict in more political and financial ways, and less so in military ways, but perhaps sort of via proxy here, by perhaps working with pro-Iranian forces in Syria, is how we might see Iran getting involved in this. The Ain al-Assad airbase in western Iraq has come under rocket fire. So Reuters are reporting this, that at least one explosion was heard within the base. The day before, the air defense system of the Ain al-Assad airbase intercepted and shot down 2 drones. So we have this is a second or third reported attack on an American asset within the Middle Eastern area in the last week. In terms of US support, not only are the carrier groups there, the UK is sending ships over. Interestingly, I've seen reports today that China is now sending ships to the region. It will be interesting to just see where they are positioned in this conflict. US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has said that the deployment of aircraft carriers to the groups of the region was not meant as a provocation, but as a deterrent. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the presence of the USS Eisenhower and its affiliated warships signal Washington's ironclad commitment to Israel's security and our resolve to deter any state or non-state actor seeking to escalate this war. Turkish President Erdogan has a different take on this. He has recently criticised the US for the move of deploying aircraft carriers into the area, saying that it may contribute to the massacres against Palestinians and destroy Gaza. He said that Erdogan has said that the deployment of the aircraft carriers to the region has hindered Turkish efforts to establish calm in the region. And he's quoted as saying, "When we raise this issue with our US counterparts, they tell us that those aircraft carrier groups were sent there as part of non-combatant evacuation operations for civilians in the region." That may be the case, and I guess they could serve that role as well. However, they are armed to the teeth with the most modern military aircraft that the Americans have, plus a whole heap of additional strike capabilities with the destroyers and other ships that are escorting them into the Mediterranean. So Iran itself. So I found an interesting article which had an interview with Sayed Ali Alavi, who is a lecturer in Middle Eastern and Iranian studies from a London university. And the article has been published with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So Radio Free Europe is a US government-funded media source. So I think it's worthwhile noting that. First, it's US funded. Before then, just quoting from some of what the lecturer, Professor Sayed Ali Alavi, has said. He was asked about Hamas's relationships with Iran, and he said, "There are misunderstandings about Hamas's relations with Iran. Hamas is ideologically connected to the Egyptian-based Muslim Brotherhood. Although the Islamic Republic of Iran politically supports Hamas, they had major disagreements during the Syrian civil war. when Hamas stood against President Bashar al-Assad of Syria and refused to support Iran's initiative in Syria. And instead, Hamas were aligned with Turkey in the conflict in Syria. Iran supports Hamas politically, as it allows Iran to be seen as the supporter of the Palestinian cause. Iran has no borders with Gaza or with the Palestinian West Bank. Iranian support seems to be limited to financial support and the transfer of technology. Having said that, Hamas receives more financial and political support from its organic allies, Qatar and Turkey. Since the Syrian war, Iran has reduced its support to Hamas, as they have different outlooks when it comes to the region beyond Palestine and Israel. So that's interesting, I think, here, because there's a lot of subtlety and nuance around the different parties in the Middle East. And so, while it's very easy to look at things in black and white and go, oh, Iran and Hamas will be aligned and Iran will support them. Well, no, it seems politically, yes, it's good for Iran to be seen in the Arab world to be supporting the Palestinian cause with some political support for Hamas, but they have different opinions, outlooks, and perhaps ideological variants once you get beyond that conflict of Palestine versus Israel. And as we've seen, Iran supporting Syria, Hamas siding with Turkey in the Syrian conflict. Going on to some of the connections, he's asked about the connections that Hamas have with other nations. Hamas officials and their political officers are based in Qatar, and they regularly visit Turkey and Egypt as well as Iran. Diplomatic visits do not necessarily translate to a flood of logistical aid, however. Gaza, of course, has been under a full Israeli blockade since 2006, and the only route in or out is through the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, which obviously Iran and Turkey and Qatar do not have any control over that crossing. Israel has revealed that its forces conducted hundreds of attacks on Iran's allies in Syria since the beginning of the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011. Nevertheless, we did not witness any escalation or Iranian retaliation at that time. So this the lecturer's, Sayed Ali Alavi's opinion is that it is unlikely that we will see Iran getting involved in the Israeli-Hamas conflict. He feels that Iran's response, like other regional states, will likely remain rhetorical and diplomatic. So this, I thought, was interesting because this is coming from a British lecturer or someone lecturing at a British university, and it's being published in an American government-funded website. And his position is that given the different ideological outlooks between Iran and Hamas, that he doesn't feel that Iran will just jump in, boots and all. Remember that Iranians are Persians by heritage, not Arabic by heritage. So again, in the West, it's very easy for us to assume that Iran is the big bad guy in this area and will get involved in a military sense. But perhaps reading a little more closely, we might find that we'll see and hear support from Iran for Hamas politically, but may not see them getting directly involved. Obviously, Iran, isn't looking for a major conflict in this area. They know the damage that could be done to them if the Americans did engage in attacking them. Likewise, but the flip side of that is I don't think the Americans want that conflict here either. They recognise the damage that could be done upon them, by Iran fully supporting Hezbollah and Hamas and the factions in Syria, and them all pouring into Israel assisting with attacks on the aircraft carriers. Now, we know now President Putin announced that he's put MiG-31 patrols with Iskanders missiles on them, permanently patrolling the southern area of the Black Sea. So now map up here. We look here, this is roughly where the MiGs are. If you just measure the distance from here down to here, which is roughly where those 2 US aircraft carriers are sitting, that's 1,000 kilometers. And those Iskanders reportedly will go to 1,500 kilometers. Even some reports I've seen of near 2,000 kilometers. So everything in Israel and the Mediterranean is within range of those MiG-31s, let alone what is in range of Iran from over here. So we'll see if Iran do decide to get involved more deeply in this conflict. Okay, might just move on to then Ukraine for a little bit. I'm going to run through the Russian Ministry of Defense update. It's always reliably good in its reporting in terms of being consistent. And we'll just have a bit of I've added in, I found a couple of other sources of news which I'll add in as we work our way through the updates. So starting as we do here up in the Kupiansk region on the northern sort of edge of the main fighting, the Russian Ministry of Defense reports that in the Kupiansk direction, units of the Zapad group of forces, supported by aviation and artillery, repelled 5 attacks of the AFU. AFU is the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Repelled 5 attacks of the AFU's 43rd and 115th Mechanized Brigades and 68th Jaeger Brigades near Sinkovka in the Kharkov region and Sergeyevka in the Lugansk People's Republic. The Ukrainians reportedly lost up to 50 Ukrainian troops and 3 pickup trucks in the fighting in this area. Moving down then here to the Krasny Liman area. In Krasny Liman, units of the Center group of forces, helicopters and artillery repelled 10 attacks of assault detachments of the AFU's 24th, 51st, 53rd, 110th Mechanized Brigades and 1st Special Operations Brigade, as well as inflicted losses on manpower and hardware of the AFU's 21st and 67th Mechanized Brigades near Nyam-Poblovka in the Donetsk People's Republic. Now, reportedly, servicemen of the Center group of forces who operate in this area have established behind the main lines of combat schools for the honing their skills and learning to how to use reconnaissance and unmanned aerial vehicles, as well as kamikaze drones in a rear area of the special military operation. They've set this up where they have experienced pilots of these drones, unmanned drones. Passing on their skills, the servicemen undergo training on computer simulators with virtual reality glasses. So much like they would be sitting in the field with some glasses on, allowing them to see from the camera of the drone, here they're able to practice their skills by having the VR goggles on and then flying a drone around a virtual environment. There is apparently a specific skill set, physical skill set that's been looked for drone pilots, and that they're looking for people who have very good sight, very good vestibular apparatus or balance control, ear control, and increased concentration. Now, the vestibular apparatus performance, I believe, would be due to the fact that if you've ever watched FPV of drone racing, where the drone pilots will fly into buildings and at high speed will fly in and then we'll just do a roll out through another open window over the roof of the building and back in again. Watching that, if you're not familiar with that, you get confused. It would be very easy to just lose where you are and like roll your drone into the floor. This is why I think, much like extreme sports, people who do parkour, people who do downhill mountain biking and can do backflips and things like that. Their vestibular area, the balance control of their ears is so good that they don't get dizzy doing that sort of thing. And so I think that's what's required here, is people who, when visually, aren't going to become confused when the whole world turns 180 on them in just a second or so. Also in this area, and this is reporting coming from Radovka Telegram channel, the Russian army has advanced in the area of Liman and at Sinkovka and Makiivka. They are repulsing attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces. There are also successes in the Serebryansky forest area, which is this forested area around here. The Ministry of Defense reports that the Ukrainian losses amounted up to 100 Ukrainian troops killed and wounded, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 2 motor vehicles, and 1 D-30 howitzer. So across the northern line, this red line here, that's reported 150 in one day, which is quite a lot in this area. Moving down to the Donetsk region. So for us, our Donetsk area is this sort of blue line here, and then down to this yellow area, Donetsk city itself. Units of the Yug group of forces, supported by aviation and artillery, inflicted losses on AFU manpower and hardware near Yasyukovka, Andriivka, Razdolovka, and Kurdyumovka in the Donetsk People's Republic. The Ukrainian Telegram channel resident, I've quoted from Resident a number of times. They appear, the Ukrainian channel, they appear to have a source within the Ukrainian government administration. Who that source is, I don't know. But they often report from their source. And this is what they say about Avdiivka in the Donetsk area. Our source reports that there is a high risk of creating an Avdiivka stranglehold for the Ukrainian armed forces, which the Russians are implementing to gradually encircle the urban agglomeration and one of the most protected territories of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Donbass direction. So again, if we just move our map up here, this is at the bottom of the screen is Donetsk city. This is Avdiivka here, and Avdiivka, the Russians are moving towards and taking Avdiivka. They're approaching the southern outskirts of the settlement here and making a push from the southwest and also from the north, and they are cutting off those access roads into Avdiivka. Goes on to say, constant Russian aerial bombing, artillery shelling, and attacks on the logistics infrastructure of Ukraine can create a shortage of equipment and manpower in this area. The Ukrainian administration understands that this sector is the most significant, but the transfer of large forces to this direction puts an end to any offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces. So Zelensky and Zelensky being caught now with not wanting to lose Avdiivka, the Russians putting an immense amount of pressure on them needing to reinforce this area, which is itself difficult as the roads are being cut. But those reinforcements are then drawing them away from the northern front, Kupiansk, where the Russians are advancing, and from the Zaporozhye region, where the Ukrainians have been attempting to get across the river, across the Dnieper, and establish a foothold there. Going on with what resident Telegram channel says. Our source reports that the Russians continue to stubbornly implement the Avdiivka noose, trying to eventually take the fortified area into a semicircle, which will complicate its supply, as was the case with Bakhmut, where there was only one road of death. Here they're talking about the one road that remained open into Bakhmut, which was under Russian fire control and which would see thunder runs of Ukrainian forces up and down there trying to evacuate wounded or trying to resupply the positions within Bakhmut. And remember that ultimately the Russians did succeed in taking control. The Wagner forces led that, the taking and the capture of Bakhmut. Resident goes on to say, the Western press is already writing about this. That is the noose forming around Avdiivka. And this issue is constantly discussed at headquarters. The Ukrainian armed forces were forced to retreat from some of their positions. The fighting has been going on for almost 12 days. Everybody's losses are heavy. That's where the front is most active right now. So this is interesting because this is coming from a Ukrainian channel. So this isn't a Russian channel saying that things are bad for the Ukrainians there. This is a Ukrainian channel saying that. Now, this next piece of reporting is from a Russian channel, No Sugar. And they say, the Avdiivka area is now subject to intense airstrikes on an hourly basis, in addition to regular artillery shelling and MLRS strikes. A wide line of Ukrainian fortifications in the region is hit by bombs ranging in caliber from 500 to 1,500 kilograms, approximately every 15 minutes. By the way, today we were on missions in the Golovka direction. What amazed us was the constant carousel of wings and rotors, aircraft and helicopters. Combat units of airplanes and helicopters changed each other like pictures in a kaleidoscope, delivering powerful blows to the enemy, the Ukrainians in this case. The frequency of explosions on Ukrainian positions from the ground sometimes resembled the work of a giant machine gun. So, the intensity of the Russian attack on Avdiivka is, I think, perhaps reaching some of the highest levels that we have encountered in this Ukrainian war thus far. In the opening days, there were reports of 200 pieces of artillery and tanks firing on the city, and MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, firing into this area. So really siege is being laid upon it. The thing in the Ukrainians' favour is that it is heavily fortified. So while there is a lot of attacking and bombing and shelling occurring, a lot of that will just be slowly destroying buildings, but not necessarily inflicting damage on servicemen, as they may well be able to retreat deep underground into some of the factories in this industrial areas within Avdiivka. However, as the Russians do carpet bomb this area and do level everything, it does then become very difficult for the Ukrainian forces, as they are left with nothing to hide behind and nothing to defend once the region has been flattened. And that, as their supplies are cut, will lead them into dire straits in the near future, I imagine. The Ministry of Defence reports that in the Donetsk region yesterday, in the last 24 hours, the Ukrainian losses totaled up to 260 servicemen killed and wounded, as well as 4 motor vehicles. In the course of counter-battery warfare, 1 US-made M777 artillery system and 1 Grad multiple launch rocket system was destroyed. In South Donetsk direction, I'll just move our map a little bit. South Donetsk and then into Zaporozhye. In South Donetsk, units of the Vostok group of forces, helicopters and artillery, inflicted losses on manpower concentration areas of the AFU's 72nd Mechanized Brigade near Ugledar and Vodyanoi in the Donetsk People's Republic. The Ukrainians reportedly lost up to 140 troops and 3 motor vehicles. The troop losses, the Russian Ministry of Defence has explained they get these numbers via interception of Ukrainian communications. They don't just guess and estimate at the numbers, it's the numbers that are being reported by the Ukrainians themselves. So if that is correct, and that is how the Ministry of Defence get these numbers, then you might believe that they are relatively accurate. You might, I guess, assume that the Ukrainians are aware they're being intercepted and they inflate the numbers to trick the Russians into thinking they're doing more damage than they are. I'm not sure if that would really work, but anyhow, as I say, these numbers, we do appear to get them consistently from the Ministry of Defence, and they do tend to reflect the general tone of the fighting in the areas they're reporting upon. So it's not just the Ministry of Defence saying that activity is hot in an area and therefore the numbers of reported Ukrainian losses are high. Everyone in social media and Ukraine and Russian sites are also reporting of heavy fighting in those areas and losses. In the South Donetsk area, reportedly 140 Ukrainian troops and 3 motor vehicles were lost in the last 24 hours. Then the Zaporozhye direction here, units of the Russian group of forces supported by aviation and artillery repelled 3 Ukrainian attacks and delivered strikes on a unit of the AFU's 118th Mechanized Brigade close to Verbova. Verbova is here. Let's get our screen a little bit bigger. There's Verbova here, Robotne there, Tokmak down here. The Ukrainians still behind this green line. They've been unable to get past this. In the Orokhovsky sector, so this is the sector here with Orokhiv here, the Ukrainian armed forces managed to advance in the Novofedorovka area north of Verbova, and on the Varemsky Ledge, which is back over here, the Varemsky Ledge area here, the Russians successfully attacked at Priutny. So here, Priutny is to the west of Urozhaina and Staromayorsk in here. And there has been fighting around Priutny for some time now. In the Zaporozhye direction, up to 20 Ukrainian troops, 2 tanks and 3 motor vehicles have been neutralised. In addition, in the course of counter-battery warfare, 1 UK-made FH-70 howitzer, 1 D-20 howitzer, as well as 1 US-made M119 howitzer was destroyed. Moving then down to the Kherson region for the update in Kherson. In the Kherson direction, up to 30 Ukrainian troops, 2 motor vehicles, 1 D-30 howitzer, and 1 electronic warfare station was neutralised. In some other reports here from another Ukrainian Telegram channel, this is translated from Ukrainian, but the reporting says, Ukrainian authorities complain about intensive strikes by Russian aircraft against concentrations of their forces in the Kherson direction. So many air bombs are now flying on the Kherson region. We have never seen any or this many. This is a speaker of the Ukrainian Kherson OVA, Tolokonikov. If earlier it was 2 to 3 per day, now it's already 38. So assuming here that on the day that this commentary was being made, instead of having 2 or 3 bombs landing in the Kherson area, they've reported 38 bombs in the day. As for the missiles, few reach us. They don't fire so many missiles across the Kherson region, but aerial bombs, they are very difficult to shoot down, almost impossible, because they fly very low and are launched quickly. As for the destruction, if they hit the house, then nothing remains of the house, and houses nearby collapse in a blast wave. So the Ukrainians themselves reporting that in the Kherson region, where they have been amassing troops for some months to try and break through Kazachi-Laheri, and through the Antonovsky Bridge in this area across the islands, they seem to be having a very difficult time of it. Units of the Dnieper group of troops reportedly stopped an attempt by the Ukrainian armed forces to land at a railway bridge near Kherson, with 20 Ukrainian forces being killed in that operation. So, yes, very tough it seems for the Ukrainians to gain a foothold here. It does look as though the Russians are able to detect their positions on the northern side or the western side of the Dnieper River and inflict damage on them even before they make the amphibious landings across the Dnieper River. Getting near the end of things here, reports that one Su-24 aircraft was intercepted by Russian aerospace forces close to Odessa, and that two MiG-29 aircraft were also shot down. Reportedly, that Su-24 was shot down. So in the last 24 hours, the Ministry of Defence is reporting one Su-24, two MiG-29, and one Mi-8 helicopter of the Ukrainian Air Force having been shot down. Now, this is a little bit of just a summary from Resident Channel again, just on some tactics about the Russians and what they're saying the Russians are doing. But the Russians with today's report actually confirm our strategic information. This is coming from Resident, a Ukrainian channel. The Russians report actually confirm our strategic information, that their primary goals at the moment are the Ukrainian armed forces, aviation and infrastructure, airfields, warehouses, hangars, where the Ukrainian armed forces hid airplanes and unmanned aerial vehicles. Also, the Russian armed forces work in the near rear of the armed forces of Ukraine. Oddly enough, the Odessa region is also now considered a near rear or priority zone. So here they're talking about the Russians not only attacking the front line, but those areas in the rear, but close to the front line. As I was saying, troop concentration, marshalling areas, ammunition depots, that type of thing. And so the Ukrainians here reporting they believe that this is the Russian strategy at the moment, is to go after the near rear and to look for aviation and infrastructure. They go on. We previously wrote why the Russians were attacking the near rear. Yesterday, the strikes were mixed tactics, which involved missiles, kamikaze drones, and added strikes with gliding bombs with a flight range of about 50 kilometers. The Russian Federation began using this tactic from the beginning of the year. The Russian forces do not spend expensive missiles to reach Ukrainian armed forces reserves in the depths, where air defense can easily operate, but instead wait for Ukraine itself to pull the reserves closer, where it will be easier and cheaper to destroy them. So again, this is why we might be seeing these Russian tactics of pressure on parts of the line in Avdiivka and Donetsk, in Kupiansk in the north, and then in Verbova in Zaporozhye region, to draw reserves forward. And like the Ukrainians say, to avoid the Russian aircraft or helicopters needing to get close to the deep rear of the Ukrainian lines, and instead just wait until they get pulled forward and then attack them then. So they say the armed forces of Russia do not need to expend expensive missiles to reach Ukrainian armed forces reserves in the depths where air defense can easily operate against them, but instead wait for Ukraine to pull the reserves closer where it will be easier and cheaper to destroy them. They also extend air defense, which is easier to destroy within a radius of 200 kilometers than in the deep rear. Add to this the fact that Landsets are the drones, the explosive kamikaze drones used against Ukrainian armour, easily work in the near rear and also monitor unmanned aerial vehicles via reconnaissance officers. Now the Russians have 10 times more UAVs than at the end of 2022. All participants in the game admit this. So, again, things not looking good at this stage for Ukraine in this conflict. Now, the conflict is going to continue for some time, no doubt, but Ukraine's ability to fight it is going to decrease. We saw that in 2022, the US agreed to provide $122 billion. Now that's running out. And to top it up, now they're looking at $60 billion. And that $60 billion, I have read reportedly, is intended to last until next September. So that's almost a year. So it's a decrease in the funding that Ukraine will receive. Yeah, I think it will be tough times for Ukraine. Anyhow, there's a lot going on in Ukraine and Israel. I'll see how I go with getting a report out tomorrow, but if not, I'll have one out in the next day or so. I hope you're enjoying your weekend, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.